All right, so this activity relates to the cloud computing arrangements. Now, in our time together, we are talking about Canvas as an example of a cloud computing arrangement that you are all familiar with because you're students and you had to use Canvas to even look at this video. But right now, I want you just to be thinking about what you've seen in your readings and the ideas behind the gap for-profit companies regarding cloud computing arrangements. So that's what this activity relates to. So we've got the operations of ERC started in 2024. ERC entered into a 2-year agreement with Almo. The agreement specifies ERC's going to pay $60,000 to Almo immediately. And in return, Almo is going to make accounting software accessible via the internet to ERC and maintain all infrastructure necessary to run the software and store the records. So Almo is hosting. In addition to the cost of the agreement, ERC incurred $10,000 early in the year devising a plan for its accounting software needs. So $10,000 spent just thinking about what do we do about our accounting needs. $20,000 for customizing its own computers for integration with Almo. So, once that agreement was in place, they knew that's where they were going to go. $20,000 spent getting everything ready to integrate with Almo's software. And then $15,000 after implementation to train employees. So we have two different scenarios that I want you to think about. And these two scenarios, no surprise, are going to pivot on what GAP tells us to do with these arrangements. So the first scenario is at any time ERC can freely remove its records from the cloud, if you will, and can run the software on its own hardware or that of another accounting services company. So actually, that implies you can download the software to run on your own, or there's another option that's available. So that's scenario one. And scenario two is ERC can remove its records, but is not able to run the software itself or have any other accounting service company to run it. And so it's how are these costs treated? What does GAP say? And if you remember from the activities that you've just looked at, when you get to, oh my goodness, having some Nearpod problems here for a second. I don't feel like stopping the video to redo them, so it's going to take me just a second. Not long, just a little bit more. We're all patient. Yes. Here we go. There we go. All right, so moving along. So on the next page, then you see there are an activity, and it's basically the same information. It's got the same set of facts, but I'm asking you, scenario one is the situation where ERC can remove the records and run the software. So what I want you to do then, or asking you to do, is think about what GAP says you do with all of these costs. Okay, so here's the way this would work. We basically need two categories. Well, yeah, didn't go very fast, did it? One to capitalize an asset and one to expense immediately. That's the way I'm going to set it up. You can look at what you came up with and see if you end up in the same place as me. Obviously, it doesn't matter which column is which, but it's capitalized versus expense. So the big piece is the $60,000 for the fee. Remember, that is for actually running the software. Now, in the situation where ERC can essentially run the software on their own hardware or have some other accounting software provider that they could use, GAAP says if they've got that freedom, and it's essentially they've got control to a sense, they've bought kind of control to the whole software. So that's going to be capitalized as an intangible asset. The 15,000 training the employees, that is an expense, unfortunately, right? Because the companies spend a lot of money on training, but that is an expense. We're going to expense that as we incur it. The 20,000 customization for that integration with Almo, that's an implementation cost. And GAAP says for these cloud computing arrangements, that piece, the 20,000, this piece, I should say, is always eligible for capitalization. All right, so let's highlight that just because we can. That was not a very pretty highlight, but that's always eligible for capitalization, those implementation costs. And then we have this 10,000 planning cost. Well, that was kind of like research. And we've talked earlier about how research is an expense. We don't capitalize research type things under US GAAP. All right, so that takes care of everything that was over here. So if we look back at the facts, that would be, we've covered all of them. We talked about what to do with the 60,000. The key idea here is that it hinges on this. Hope it's not going to let me do that in that little box. It's going to make a line somewhere else. But ERC can freely remove the records and run the software. That's the key. Is there somewhere you can, you've paid for the 60,000. Can you actually determine where you run it? If so, then you can capitalize. All right. And then we talked about the 20,000. The 20,000 is the implementation cost, and GAAP says those implementation costs can be capitalized. Right. So there we go. And the training and the 10,000 planning, those are both going to be expensed. Okay. Let's see what happens. It's going to tell me I did submit. Oh, it did. Good. Okay, so now let's look at the other situation. And this is the same set of facts, but it's the situation where ERC has not got control of the software, can freely remove the records, but cannot run the software on its own hardware or that of another accounting services company. So this is a situation where you can get your data. That's almost always true. I can get my own data, but without that software from Almo, that data is pretty much useless. Nobody else can run it. Okay, so the same question then, basically, what do we do with these costs? So here I've got 3 categories. This time I've got 3 columns, and I'm going to put these capitalized as an asset, expense immediately, and then I've got a new one I'm going to call capitalize as a prepaid expense. And you guys remember what prepaid expense is? Just when you've paid in advance for something. A lot of times we take like prepaid rent is what you frequently will remember from your earlier accounting classes. All right, so let's see if we can figure out where these costs might make the most sense according to GAAP. Those training the employees on the software, well, that happened after the software was in place. And that, as we saw in the last example, that's an expense. The training employees, that's just going to be something we expense. The planning costs, same thing. Those were research type activities, and we're going to expense those immediately. Now let's look about the customization. Do you remember the customization I told you in the last set of examples? I don't know why it's not going to look pretty here because it's going to make not fit in the box. It doesn't give me a way to resize it, so we're just going to keep it there. But that implementation cost, we do get to capitalize that. That becomes an intangible asset. And we'll talk in module 2 about what we do with that later. But even if we can't control the software, remember with this situation, we can remove our records, but cannot run the software. Even so, we had those implementation costs associated with this whole arrangement, and GAAP allows us to capitalize that $20,000. All right, which you obviously know where I'm headed. I'm now left with this $60,000 fee that we paid immediately. Now, this is where the GAAP on cloud computing is very clear. It says that if the situation is such that the company cannot control the software, in other words, cannot download the software, cannot take the data and use some alternative, doesn't have some alternative software that does the same thing, in that situation, though that fee that is paid cannot be capitalized as an intangible asset. Okay, so it is not going to stay in this column. Okay, it's not going to be capitalized immediately as an intangible asset. But one thing that struck me when I was preparing these lessons for you is that if we paid the whole year fee at one point, or the whole 2-year fee at one point, that would be a prepaid expense, because that doesn't change. That reality about accounting doesn't change just because we're talking about a different kind of arrangement. If we paid, rent 2 years in advance, we'd call that a prepaid expense. So this $60,000, if it's paid immediately, so the immediately is the key here, is that, and I'm gonna, use my fancy highlighter and highlight this. It's paid immediately. That's the key. Because it's paid immediately, we can capitalize that whole $60,000 as a prepaid expense. And you guys remember what happens with prepaid expenses over those 2 years. All right, so I guess the big takeaway is the intangible asset would not include the $60,000. It would be over here as a prepaid expense. But the $20,000 in implementation cost would be considered an intangible asset. All right, that's my explanation.